Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. And I will hand over to Rami for the housekeeping rules, and we can start.
Hello, everyone. A quick housekeeping rules before we start the webinar. If you would like to ask a question to the speakers, please use the chat function. Our team will relay the questions to the moderators and we'll tackle them. For any technical issues, please use the chat or send an email to webinars@worldenergy.org. And on final note, the slides and the recording will be shared after the webinar. Another quick guide for the webinars function on Teams. You can change how you view the meeting. You can use the camera mute, chat or reactions, or you can translate the slides into your own language and turn on the English captions. And now passing on to Paul.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Lucy. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar today. Thank you for joining. Today we're publishing our working paper on regional insights into low carbon hydrogen scale-up. This is the final installment in a series of publications on hydrogen, produced in collaboration with our very good partners at PwC and EPRI. We started with a global report published last July. The conversations that led up to that report and around that report convinced us that we needed to delve deeper into the regional stories. And so this latest working paper reflects regional conversations with more than 180 high-level experts from 67 countries around the world. And those countries represent more than 80% of world energy consumption, nearly 90% of world GDP. We want to thank everyone who's given their time to contribute to those conversations. I think it's been a great example of the power of the World Energy Council community to convene expertise and to create space for insightful conversations. Throughout this process, we've seen interest in low carbon hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels grow. There's sort of hype around hydrogen. More dialogue is needed to sort out some of the challenges. The World Energy Council is proudly neutral and impartial. We're not in the business of promoting hydrogen or any other fuel. We're in the business of promoting dialogue about hydrogen. And so more dialogue is needed. This webinar is another step in that journey of conversations around hydrogen. So we're delighted to be part of this. And I'll hand over now to our partners to say a word of welcome, starting with Jeroen.
So thanks, Paul. I'm Jeroen van Hoof. I lead our global energy practice in PwC. And hydrogen and actually low carbon fuels are a key part of the strategy we see to move towards net zero. So it has been actually quite insightful and an honor to work with EPRI and WEC on these series of studies and to be engaging with all of you via the webinars as we have today on this important topic. And I think in addition to what Paul said, important to say that if we want to reach Paris goals, we need to decarbonize the heavy energy consuming industries. And that can only be done with molecules. And hydrogen is an excellent example of a way to do so. This is not something for the short term. It will take time for hydrogen to scale up. And the work that has been done around regions has actually helped us to get more insight on the various positions regions have and the obstacles that need to be taken, what a role they want to play in this system, either supplying or demanding, and in what way. With what's currently happening in the world, and I'm referring to the Ukraine crisis, the importance of thinking through how we can support the energy transition has even become more important, because the decisions we take today will have an effect for the long term. And it's easy maybe to think short term now, but the trick is actually to combine short-term and long-term solutions that actually support the energy transition. Because I'm quite certain that if we make the right choices now, that will be solutions that are there to stay. So with that in the back of our minds, I think this discussion, although it's not the solution for tomorrow, is a very important one. And I look forward to the conversation and further work we can do together in the market. So I look forward to this conversation, and that would be my introductory comments.
Thanks, Jeroen. Now we can hear from Jeffery.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Jeffery Preece. I'm a director of R&D at EPRI. And on behalf of all of my colleagues at EPRI, I'd like to thank the World Energy Council and colleagues at PwC for this very important and very significant collaboration and achieving this next milestone. There's a significant goal that society has set its sights to for decarbonizing the energy economy. And we all certainly recognize the path forward is not simple. And the way that we as consumers rely and use energy, it will certainly change. And we already see a lot of these changing starting to take shape today as various parts of the world begin to reckon with a number of different challenges and opportunities. The worldwide dynamics are already leading to, in some cases, faster adoption of new technologies. And in the case of hydrogen, it's very interesting to see that commitments are being made at levels which certainly some of us did not foresee coming, but who can really see the future. So the key is, as was earlier discussed, to continue these discussions around hydrogen, to understand the role it plays in the grand scheme of decarbonization, our energy footprint, of understanding the role that hydrogen could play and where it could play. And one of the key takeaways for me from the analysis and the work that's been done here is the need and the continued focus on having multiple options available. Certainly, as you look into regional aspects of decarbonization, of energy supply and energy security, on the impacts for equity and environmental justice, it will come down to communities, it will come down to regions making this transition happen based on very global and yet local decision points that are so important to, again, the way we as consumers use energy and rely on it. So we all have a role to play. This should be very personal, and collaboration is important now more than ever, because as we investigate the role of hydrogen and other low carbon fuels and this energy transformation for our regions, but also in the global perspective, we must come together to continue to work together towards a very important goal. So again, thank you to all the colleagues at World Energy Council and at PwC, and thank you very much for the panelists for speaking today. I look forward to the conversations.
Thank you, Jeffery. And we do have a very good panel just waiting in the wings to come and share their thoughts with you. Before we get to the panel, I'm just going to give you a very quick summary of the key findings of the working paper. I'll keep it very brief because we want to get on to the discussion. So if we can have the first slide, there we go. Key findings, the first one, no surprise, I'm sure to all of you, we do see significant potential for low carbon hydrogen and derivative fuels to play a role in the energy transition. The issues are all around how that potential can be realized and some of the challenges in getting to meeting that potential. We see a lot of regional diversity in that, and that's why we need to go to the regional level to understand some of the blockers and enablers. And we think the challenges are probably best captured by the phrase how to. If the world wants to move towards more low carbon hydrogen in the mix, how is that going to happen? And there's a number of issues under how to that we can unpack. Next slide, please. One of the most fascinating graphics, I think, in the pack is this map. It shows where we think by 2040 what the flows of hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels might look like. It's a sketch map. It just shows potential flows. There's a couple of interesting things to pull out of this. One is the two largest energy markets, USA and China, on this map are broadly self-sufficient. Now there may be some trade at the margin, but those two big markets look broadly self-sufficient in low carbon hydrogen. We see two very large importing hubs, one based around Europe or Northwest Europe, one based around Japan and Korea, maybe a third hub in Southeast Asia based around Singapore. Those are the areas that are attracting low carbon hydrogen into those markets. A number of places potentially as exporters. A couple of interesting ones to point out that have the potential to either go to Europe or to Asia. So we have Chile, we have Australia, we have the Middle East as exporting areas that could have options to go either or to both markets. You will notice this map shows an arrow coming out of Russia into Europe. The analysis, of course, was done prior to the Ukraine crisis, so we might have to put a big question mark over that particular trade flow for now. Next slide. As we've heard, it's all about collaboration, coordination. How do we get to scale in low carbon hydrogen? We need coordination amongst stakeholders at various different levels. It's about partnership, so public-private partnership between countries. And there's a little map there, or network map, of some of the bilateral partnerships that have already emerged or are emerging, with some particular nodes starting to appear as countries get together to try and work out some of the issues around low carbon hydrogen. The issues are different at regional level. At the national level, well, every nation is going to need a strategy, and a lot of those have now emerged. And there's growing support for development of hydrogen hubs. We're starting to see quite a few examples of countries running experiments, if you like, with hydrogen hubs. I used to work for BP, my old employer. I follow the news. They've got a hydrogen hub they're working on at Teesside in the UK, and a new one they've just said they're going to work on in Texas. So these things are happening around the world. Next slide. The debate so far, a lot of it has been focused on the technical feasibility and the economics, and we see a need to shift the focus now. The technical economic, that still remains very important, but there's a need to shift our focus towards the user perspective. What's the cost to users? How do users integrate this fuel with the other things they're doing in energy? How do they get transparency and trust? How do they understand exactly where the low carbon hydrogen is coming from? All those kind of issues, I think, are now coming to the fore. We need to look in particular at the social impacts, jobs impacts around some of these developments, and those are areas which are starting to be addressed now. So with that, I think we're moving on to the next slide. That was a quick run through some of the key findings. We're about to go into the panel discussion. We have a great lineup of panelists. I'm going to hand over now to our moderators to introduce that panel. Our moderators being Lana here from the World Energy Council and Jeroen from PwC.
Thanks for setting the scene, Paul, and sort of the quick review of the work and what we have done sort of over the last month. Yes, I want to quickly set the scene, and then Lana is going to ask our speakers to introduce. I mean, we all know that, and with the different reports coming out, hydrogen is becoming sort of increasingly relevant. So we know it's important for the decarbonization of various sectors, and it is essential to reach a net zero targets because we cannot electrify everything. I mean, while we can electrify a lot, not everything is electrifiable, hence we need the green molecules. What I would like to do actually, I mean, we'll talk about the regional differences. If there are any questions in between, please put them in the chat. We'll try to incorporate them in our discussion to make sure that everything is answered. So we'll keep an eye on the chat. If you have any questions, let us know. And until then, I would say, Lana, please, I hand over to you, and let's get started with our panelists.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. And good day and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We've got a very good set of panel to engage with today. So to the panel members, welcome again. By way of introduction, you're just going to spend about a minute introducing yourselves. We've got panelists from Europe, Latin America, and North America. Beatrice, if I could start with you, could you take about a minute to just introduce yourself to the audience? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be here. So I am Beatrice Buffon. I am Vice Chair for Europe. And I am also the head of the international division of EDF, Électricité de France. So dealing with many energy developments throughout the world, in particular in hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. If we can go to Latin America, Max, could you introduce yourself very briefly?
Sure. Thank you, Lana. So my name is Max Correa. I'm Chilean. I was until very recently working at the Ministry of energy here in Chile. And I had the privilege of leading the creation and then starting the implementation of the Chilean hydrogen and derivative strategy. And now, about 2 months ago, I moved to the private sector, and I'm the director for LATAM for a Danish fund called CIP, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which they have like around 20 billion euros in renewable infrastructure. And we are aiming to, with a new fund called the Energy Transition Fund, we're aiming to support and then deploy hydrogen and derivatives projects here in Latin America.
Thank you very much, Max. And finally, to Mark, a couple of minutes introducing yourself. Sorry, under a minute, introducing yourself.
Hi all, Mark Kirby. I am actually the former, as of last week, president and CEO of the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association. Had the pleasure of handing that responsibility over to Ms. Yvette Vera Perez, and I'm going to be focusing as senior advisor on supporting strategy implementation, the Canadian hydrogen strategy implementation. And prior to that, long years of experience in the private sector, working on commercializing technologies in and around hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you all for your introductions, and I'll pass back to Jeroen for the first set of questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lana. Yes, I mean, we see regional differences for hydrogen, and we would like to get your feedback on how do you see sort of hydrogen and its derivatives scale in your part of the world, let's say probably particularly over the next decade. And maybe Mark, if you want to start, so how do you see hydrogen scale up and its derivatives for the next decade?
Well, we're seeing a lot of activity as are all parts of the world, and it is centering around hub development, leading to larger scale production, leading to hopefully exports, and generally building out of eventually more of a network or a grid across the country. But it's all starting with trying to concentrate applications around it, and that's because of the difficulties we see. And certainly in the case of hydrogen, it has to be attracting private sector investment into this. That's about managing risk, for that means that for hydrogen and fuel cell, hydrogen fueling station developers, it's about demand certainty, volume and pricing. For the OEMs, it's about again demand, but this time end user demand for their products. And for the end users, it's supply risk, hydrogen at a reasonable price, fueling stations that are needed, and vehicles that are cost effective and deliver the performance they need. So all three of those, all those aspects have to come together for private companies to make those investments that are going to be necessary. And so it's really interesting to see the differences between what's happening, let's say, in California, in the US, and in Canada, as to how that's being driven. I'm of course most familiar with the Canadian situation, but we are seeing, because my member companies work around the world in selling products and services in Japan, Korea, China, Europe, and for a long term, I've been selling into the California and US market. So California, as you know, has led the world in light duty vehicle sales up until recently. It's strong in buses, showing promises in trucking, although still early. And the drivers there have been, the policy drivers, the ZEV mandates, the low carbon fuel standard, in particular the credits that close that price gap between diesel, gasoline, and hydrogen. Funding for stations, although that's being displaced with the low carbon fuel credits, and particularly the capacity-based credits. They also have mandates for bus fleets to convert to zero emission and have a plan for 100% conversion, which leads people to mix batteries and fuel cells. They recognize they need a mix of both those vehicles. So it's been, progress there, but concern they've had is that hydrogen has been fairly costly and in tight supply, and vehicle models are limited. The growth has been modest versus let's say batteries. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen now. We've got the production tax credit and the hub funding. that should lower the cost of that hydrogen and increase its availability, which I think will help to spur adoption. And we're also seeing that states outside of California are implementing low carbon fuel standards and zero emission vehicle mandates, which to help drive it. So, you know, I would expect there's going to be significant activity in the U.S. moving forward. Canada, on the other hand, more aggressive, particularly on the policy front. And there's been, you know, strong policy moves here in terms of price on carbon, clean fuel standard, zero emission vehicle requirements, 100% by 2035, 100% heavy duty by 2040, with interim targets, and an all sort of framework of the hydrogen strategy for Canada to drive that. So that's been on the policy side, and it's also supported by quite significant funding, multi-billion-dollar funding. Although in Canada, it's not hydrogen specific. Canada prides itself on being technology neutral, so there's significant funding, but it is, you know, $1.5 billion for a clean fuel fund, hydrogen and other clean fuels, 400 million for zero emission vehicle charging / infrastructure, 4.5 billion for zero emission buses, hydrogen counts, $500 million for zero emission trucks. So significant dollars, 7.5 billion for industrial accelerator. So significant funding, but going forward. So all that's applicable to hydrogen is helping to drive things forward there. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. That was a pretty good overview of the sort of North American situation. Max, maybe can you give us your view on how hydrogen is going to scale or likely to scale over the next decade in Latin America?
Sure. Although I agree with pretty much what Mark said, the situation in Latin America has some particularities. What I've seen lately, it's not so much a push or of the local demand or local applications. Rather, what is growing very rapidly, it's the large scale, at least the announcement of large scale projects in the region. And I've seen movement not only in Chile, but also in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Uruguay, and even in countries like Bolivia. And I have heard of projects there. And their conception from the very beginning is very different, right? They are all like aiming to have like gigawatt scale production of renewables. They need a large site to produce those renewables. They need infrastructure. So the challenges are a bit different. The challenges, I said, are a bit different. So you face, and also you face the lack of qualified people, resource skills, the lack of infrastructure in the place. We need ports, we need pipelines to if we think of building those projects in the coming years. So lots of movement in Latin America, basically all aiming to large scale projects for export to the centers of demand, Asia, Europe, the US eventually. And I was glad to see Chile on Paul's slide at the beginning, because that is happening, right? Ammonia is the preferred carrier. So yeah, lots of movement, and I think we're in the moment when the rubber meets the road. I've seen financial commitments, actually people putting money in these projects, so it's not on the paper or just on the announcement anymore. So, and I've seen that in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, and in other places.
But I mean, you mentioned large scale export projects. Do you really think it can work if you only focus on export? Shouldn't there be sort of a certain percentage on hydrogen being used locally to create demand? And decarbonize sort of local activity, only send everything offshore?
I mean, we thought of that. When we created the strategy for Chile, we thought local demand will be necessary to kickstart the industry. I mean, local demands is good for many reasons, not only for, I mean, it creates like an industry for the country and create jobs in the country, and you add value here in the countries in Latin America, which they needed so badly. But in reality, what I've been seeing is that there are many players willing to, from the very beginning, to create projects for exports, right? Securing land with great renewable resources, near a port, and access to water for the electrolysis. And because of the resource being so good and the capacity factor being so high, they are thinking of like my company, CIP, aiming to produce ammonia, green ammonia at a very competitive price. And we are already speaking with traders and possible off-takers to create 100% off the grid projects, hydrogen projects.
Mhm. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks for the insights. And Beatrice, so what do you think? How is hydrogen going to scale and develop over the next decade? I mean, particularly in the European context.
Yes, well, in Europe, we carried out a study last year with WEC Europe, and we estimate that the consumption in Europe by 2050 could represent around 60 million tons per year of hydrogen, exactly between 50 and 70. So it's a range between 50 and 70 million tons of hydrogen per year. And we estimate that we would be able in Europe to produce half of it domestically, but half of it would have to be imported. So it's of course a huge amount. It means 30 million to import per year. And we assessed that we would need to invest around $1 trillion by 2050 to reach such level of imports. And this investment, which is huge, would be half for generation itself, like in the south of Chile, and half for transportation, logistics. It could be pipelines, it could be vessels, harbors, all the needed infrastructures to import H2. So it means huge investments and to be able to scale up. Of course, uncertainties are significant. What share will be really produced in Europe? What share will be imported? What cost do we manage to reach? Many uncertainties. And obviously, to be able to invest such amounts in a new sector, we need visibility. Private investors will need long-term planning, will need long-term contracts. So we believe that, I would say, the balance between short-term prices and long-term signals must be revised towards the latter. Indeed, we see projects under development and people spending money, but today it's, I would say, limited amount of money. It's for development purposes, but to be able to reach financial closure of such projects with billions invested, with lenders on board, we need more visibility and long-term contracts, considering the amounts to be invested. It will come, but we're not there yet. So scaling up supposes that we manage to reach this long-term visibility and contracts.
It's certainly something we hear when we talk to our clients as well, right? I mean, if we talk to large energy consumers, or let's say the financial sector, they do need these long-term certainty. Otherwise, I mean, these are sort of assets with long lifetimes and large volumes. So yes, I can only underpin that, what you've said. Well, thanks for your view on how to see this. I mean, energy supply is certainly one topic of relevance, and Lana, I think you have a few questions for that.
Yes, thanks, Jeroen. So we have been talking a little bit, and I've heard from some of the speakers around spurring adoption or scaling up, or the challenges around it. We do want to look a little bit around the production technologies. Are there any new hydrogen production technologies that we can consider to be potentially relevant? Mark, if some perspective from you will be very helpful for the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it was mentioned earlier on that it is going to be very much a regional situation. People are going to look to their regional energy resources and see how they can produce that hydrogen locally to avoid some of those transportation costs and to preserve independence. And so there are some, I think the main heavy lifters of the high volume production will be electrolyzer technology tied to very low cost power, and the natural gas reforming technologies, autothermal reforming and SMR, coupled to carbon management, carbon sequestration. But there are some really interesting technologies that are coming forward. One in particular is pyrolysis, which is where you take natural gas and crack it into hydrogen and carbon, not emitting CO2. Now that is, in theory, looks like it's inefficient because you're not producing as much hydrogen as you would if you reformed it using water, where you get roughly twice as much hydrogen per natural gas molecule. But what it does is it gives you two products. It gives you that elemental carbon, which can be used, and it avoids, of course, the CO2 emissions and the costs associated with that. So that's a really interesting technology. It's still at early stages. A couple examples in Canada. We have several companies that are working on that, including some here in Vancouver that are using a pulsed waveform, others using microwave technology, others catalytic technology. So it's an interesting early stage technology that has the potential to allow local production and relying on our existing natural gas grid to move the energy to market and then producing the hydrogen at site. So that's an interesting one to watch. In addition, there are the reforming of the biomass products. Again, a number of them working in the North American, Canadian context. The nuclear industry is very keen to turn nuclear reactors into being able to produce heat, power, and hydrogen. And so they're working on high temperature reforming technologies, and here in Canadian Nuclear Labs is working on that, and there's also the Canadian division of Fuel Cell Energy working on high temperature solid oxide technology for that. So all interesting new technologies, but also there's the new sequestration technologies, new separation technologies, ways to separate that CO2 from reformer technology, all of which are helping to drive down the cost of producing large quantities of low-cost hydrogen. So it's an exciting field, and I think there's it's difficult to predict who's going to be, which particular companies are going to be winners, but I think you're going to see a proliferation of clean hydrogen production technologies coming forward that are suited to different markets.
Thank you very much, Mark. Jeroen, over to you for other questions to the panel members.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if we want to look at develop this market, I mean, where do you focus your business activities or development activities? And certainly, I mean, within sort of confidentiality. It was mentioned ammonia earlier. We heard about hydrogen. So do you see, I mean, what areas or derivatives do you focus on at the moment? And do you see changes coming within sort of the next 10 years? For example, using ammonia today and then maybe switching to liquid hydrogen transport later on. How do you see this pathway develop? Maybe Beatrice, Europe as a sort of future import country for hydrogen. What do you think? Ammonia first and then liquid hydrogen, or any other alternatives?
There were many questions in your question. So
yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I noticed that myself. So
first, maybe just to give some elements. First, what we see under development today in Europe in the short term and with first implementations is projects on the side of the consumers. So on the side of industries to decarbonize heavy industry, or in cities to feed some buses, so for mobility, and usually long-range mobility. So that the first project we see, small scale, but in, I would say, hard to abate sectors where direct electrification is maybe complicated. So that's the first project we see today. Obviously, and I said it earlier, we will need to import hydrogen, but it will take time. So that's why I think that through time, by 2030, 2040, things will change dramatically, because we need years to build big projects, as we mentioned in South Chile or in the Middle East or in Australia, to build huge renewable capacities, electrolyzers, new harbors. All this logistics will take years. And obviously, if we manage to put in place the relevant market design with long-term signals, it will come. And it will allow Europe to get access to much larger hydrogen volumes. And we may then use it in a longer term, not only for hard to abate industries or long range transport, but also maybe in CCGT that would be used not as load based, not as load, but as tools for peak hours, where we would use it only, I don't know, a few hundred hours per year to compensate the intermittency of wind and solar. Then it could make sense in these cases to use hydrogen if we have managed to reach low prices with big scale and large volumes being imported and produced domestically in Europe. So that's why through time, to answer your question, yes, I think the changes will be significant. And I just like to give an example, because it's something I have experienced personally. 10 years ago, when you looked at offshore wind, prices were around 100, 200 euros per megawatt hour. The prices have been divided by 4 in 10, 15 years. And honestly, nobody, or not many people, had anticipated such a quick increase, such a quick decrease. It took time, like the price was stable for years, and then in 10 years, the decrease was steep and was a surprise for the players, but it was helped by the big scale and the progress in technology. So, and it came a bit as a surprise, because the target of such low prices were like 2030, but we managed to reach it in 2020. So sometimes you can have acceleration, and then of course for hydrogen, depending on the speed of decrease, it will have a big impact on the usage in Europe.
Thanks for that, Beatrice. Max, I mean, we spoke about ammonia earlier. How do you see this? Do you really see this as sort of the initial starter for export? And how do you see this change over time then?
At least what we're seeing now is ammonia, and when we think of ammonia, and if you think in these large scale projects, you have to think in 25, 30 years time ahead, right? So if you decide ammonia is the carrier today, and you invest in the Haber-Bosch plant for your project, you are locked in there for decades. So in my view, everything, there are some projects of methanol, for example, in Chile, or even synthetic fuels. But ammonia, it's kind of winning that race. And what I'm seeing from the off-taker side is that ammonia has lots of demand and lots of different types of off-takers, which is really good for de-risking the project, right? So whether it's fertilizers or shipping for the shipping industry, or even for ammonia for co-firing in the power production in Japan, for example, which is happening as of we speak. I think it's ammonia. It's a safe candidate to invest in. I don't know if in the future it will be liquid hydrogen, could be, or other carrier. But as I said before, so if you think of your project today and you think of, if you're realistic on your timeline and you decide to build an ammonia reactor, your investment will be locked in for many years. So so far it's ammonia. It could change. Obviously, it depends on where you are in the planet, or who do you think your off-takers are. But in the case of Chile, on Brazil and Argentina, thinking for export the product long distances, it's ammonia so far.
Okay, thanks for that. And I agree. I think there might be change over time, but ammonia, there's plenty of use at the moment. I mean, what we see at the moment with the war in Ukraine happening and sort of the energy crisis, Lana, why don't you take us through a couple of questions and a point of view for this regarding this topic?
Thanks, Jeroen. The present reality is within the energy ecosystem, as Jeroen has mentioned, we do have this energy crisis. So it will be interesting to understand from the panel members how you see the low carbon hydrogen playing in today's energy crisis. I recognize we do have panels from different regions, and the crisis could be climate, conflict, affordability, or living conditions. I would like to start with Mark. If you could give us some perspective on how you see low carbon hydrogen playing in today's crisis.
Well, what we're seeing is an increased interest. I mean, we have ministerial level meetings between Germany and Canada discussing, how do we accelerate the growth in the hydrogen export market from Eastern Canada to Germany. So I think you're seeing an acceleration in interest. These are long-term projects. It's difficult and takes a significant amount of capital, but we certainly are seeing a step up in the level of activity. I believe that it's very important to look at those export opportunities, to start capitalizing on them. But I will go back to the beginning that we need to be developing those demand side of the equation, and I would say that's probably one of the most critical things now, is to start getting matching investment in the demand side to what we're seeing happening in the production side. And that goes right around the world, because the export market is a very exciting and interest politicians, and interests people in the scale, but it all has to be backed up with demand, and getting that demand, certainly seeing those applications starting to grow in trucking, in aviation, etc., is really important.
Thank you very much, Mark. Max, your perspective from your region?
Sure. I wanted to highlight, maybe it's different from what we conceive as the energy crisis and what's happening in Ukraine and everything. What we are seeing here in Latin America, for example, is related to green hydrogen and large-scale projects. It's how should we deal with the social and environmental aspects of these projects. If you think of building a gigawatt scale solar plant or wind farm, it's a massive use of territory, right? And in that territory, normally there are not only communities but ecosystems that you have to take care of, right? For example, birds. In Patagonia, there is a growing concern about the protection of birds, and they migrate from Patagonia to the Arctic. And if you install gigawatt scale farms without thinking it very carefully about it, you can end up like affecting very valuable piece of wildlife. So, and you're competing for the territory. So it's a thing that it's a growing thing that we should be really be worried about doing things right in the social and environmental things in this new mindset of producing and consuming energy, right? The use of territory. So that would be my angle.
Thank you very much, Max. Very insightful perspective on the use of territory. Beatrice, over to you in terms of how you see low carbon hydrogen playing in today's energy crisis, especially the European perspective.
Well, yes, in today's crisis, not much, because today is today, and hydrogen today represents not much. But if we look at longer term, we estimate that hydrogen could represent between 10 and 15% of the energy mix by 2050 in Europe. So it means that, of course, it will help in dealing with the climate situation as it replaces hydrocarbons. But of course, we need to be sure that the electrolyzers, the photovoltaic panel, the wind turbine supply is safe. Otherwise, we may trade energy dependency for technological dependency. We clearly need to pay more attention to the resilience of hydrogen value chains. And as I said, in Europe, at least, we cannot produce domestically all the quantities needed because we don't have enough space. You mentioned the territories issue, and it's true that to install PV panels and wind turbines to produce low carbon hydrogen, you need significant territories, and we don't have enough in Europe considering the needs we have. So we will have to import, and here again, we need to pay attention to the suppliers, not to be dependent on a specific geography. The good news is that there is a variety of places where hydrogen can be produced, where the resources in renewables are potentially high. Wind blows in South Chile, solar is important in the Middle East. Australia has also many resources to produce more renewables. So there are several places with large available territories and wind and solar resources. That's good news, but it needs to be handled carefully so that we manage to implement this project in enough in a large number of countries so that we are not dependent on one specifically, to avoid any dependency as we see today with the gas coming from Russia, obviously.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Very good perspectives from the different regions. In the interest of time, Jeroen, I will hand over to you for some questions from the participants. I do note a hand from Mark. Jeroen?
Mark, I saw Mark's hand. You want to quickly comment on this? Or was
yes, just a very quick comment that I do think that there's been the blue-green debate, and I do think that it's as we recognize the important role that hydrogen can play, we do need to recognize that our ability to scale low carbon hydrogen production and from using fossil fuel resources is quite good. We can do that. So, for example, there's already 1 million tons a year of clean hydrogen projects announced in Alberta, and that's using a modest amount of what's already produced in terms of natural gas there. So I think it's one of the things we need to be looking at is all forms of clean hydrogen production to get where we need to go. Thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was about to ask you the first question that was posted in the chat. So the one with the sort of, how do you see sort of with the growing role in basically dirty hydrogen all the way to clean hydrogen? So I think you already answered that one nicely, and I actually believe that there is a role for both. I mean, think about projects where we have like ammonia production. I mean, it's huge point sources of CO2 emissions, and if there is a CO2 storage site available, then it does make sense to decarbonize or decarbonize this the operation of this asset at a sort of fairly short time frame.
Absolutely. Sorry,
No.
we need standards in place that so we can certify the full life cycle GHG emissions from that production, and I think those are coming into play around the world now. It's quite a bit of work being done there, and we need policy that puts a price on higher carbon hydrogen production technologies or rewards lower carbon hydrogen production technologies, and I think that's also coming. So I think you're going to see that there's going to be a drive towards actually clean hydrogen, and that's a good thing. It'll enable all sorts of different means of producing hydrogen, which is what we need.
Mm-hmm. And it's maybe just as a quick comment. I mean, we see the EU taxonomy as a regulation, and initially there was a lot. They moved away from this green versus blue debate. There's the carbon intensity for hydrogen, and it's 3 tons of CO2 per ton of hydrogen. So this is basically compared to natural gas production, this is 70% capture rate for CO2. So this is, I think, this move of, let's say, be agnostic and move towards a low carbon hydrogen world is already taking shape in some of the regulation. Well, thanks for that. Another one that is coming in is about infrastructure. Particularly gas and regarding gas infrastructure. Question is, there are some operators trying to make natural gas pipelines ready for switch to hydrogen. Do we see this as a starting point? Beatrice, I guess in the European context, there is a discussion. Maybe you can comment on this a bit further.
Yes, indeed, blending is being considered, and yes, indeed, we are considering adding H2 in existing pipelines, 10%, 20%. But if you want to do more, you will need dedicated pipelines. So it can be done and it will be done, but it's not the solution. It's only the starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And then there's one question that's, I would say, it's almost written for Max here. How do you see the Latin American green hydrogen ammonia projects being financed? Max, what would your view be on that?
Yes, I think it's different for different types and scales and applications of hydrogen projects, right? So, but in the end, if the project is commercially viable, it's easier to finance. So that's why these really large scale ones are aiming to produce a very competitive product, ammonia at a very competitive price in the long run. Even so the premium being very small. But if you think of smaller scale hydrogen projects for local demand, probably you will need blended finance and some subsidies on support of the government. And we're here in Chile doing that. Or maybe some tax exemptions or some sort of incentives to help those projects that are really important to create the local industry. But so we are seeing that. But in my case, what I'm working in now, which is large scale, I think we will depend on the markets and typical project finance or for large scale project because your product being so competitive.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yes, finance is, I think it's going to be a major topic to get this, to get the hydrogen economy on the ground. And maybe just sort of a final question before handing it over to Paul for sort of a quick wrap up and the closing. The aspect of sector coupling. I mean, we see hydrogen is sort of many industries could start producing hydrogen. We see the oil and gas sector with the utilities. So there, we see cooperation with the steel industry and let's say other large consumers. How do you see the role of sector coupling in growing this business? And maybe Mark, this question towards you, your view on the role of sector coupling and hydrogen.
I think it's very important because that gives you the scale that you need to get to the low costs that we're being talked about. So we need to be seeing the large demands, the industrial processing demands, and refineries and chemical plants, etc., also being tapped in to supply the transportation, the growing transportation needs, so that we can get the costs down on that hydrogen to be competitive with gasoline and diesel. And so we can start using that hydrogen cost effectively in blending for heating applications. So I think it's very important that we start looking at how do we develop hubs or valleys or corridors that couple some of those different sectors together and get that demand up to where it needs to be. And I know that's being worked on around the world. There's hubs projects being worked on in Europe. We've got many of them. We've probably got Canada's leading hydrogen hub is in Alberta. It couples refining, fertilizer production, ammonia production, heating applications, buses, trucks, and the airports now getting involved to start setting them. So it's really pulling together all of that onto a hydrogen pipeline that which can produce and low carbon hydrogen production capacity. So I think it's the way we need to start. We need to get things going with those hubs and coupling things together to get that real thing built.
Great. Well, I mean, we are almost out of time, really. So an hour goes by very quickly. Usually, thanks for your insight, and really thanks for spending the hour with us. Lana, thanks for the moderation, and sort of maybe quick wrap up and then closing of the session from Paul. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, and let me first add my personal thanks to our panelists, Beatrice, Mark and Max, and to Jeroen and Lana for the moderation. That was a really great discussion. Thanks for sharing those insights. I think we've heard quite clearly there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of experiments, many of them on the supply side. The crisis has kind of stepped up the momentum of interest. We've also heard that to really scale up, we're going to need, or the world will need to see some long-term commitments, and that long-term signals are going to be very important to that. So that's an area to watch. I think need to develop the demand side. That came through quite strongly, and actually ultimately that is the source of those long-term signals. It's the demand side that needs to really start showing some long-term signals to encourage the supply side. We heard about the need to address social and environmental impacts. Very, very important, and obviously very close to our hearts at the World Energy Council. This webinar actually brings to a close this current phase of work on low carbon hydrogen. So an issue we have, a question we have internally is, what do we do with this conversation? We had a great conversation over the last several months on hydrogen. What do we want to do with it? Where do we take it next? In what form? How would we resource that if we want to carry on the conversation? We'd love to hear from participants by email or by whatever process. If you'd like us to carry on the conversation, what kind of topics, how might that work? Ultimately, we need stakeholders talking to stakeholders. And again, there's a question about how does that happen? What's the resource behind coordination and getting stakeholders to talk to stakeholders? That's, I think, where we need to leave it for today. We've got the publication out there. We've had the webinars. Great discussion. Thanks, everybody. Thanks all for participating. Any final words from anyone? I think we're good to close. Thanks everyone very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.